리처드 도킨스 박사와 서울대 장대익 교수님과의 대담이 진행될 예정인데요. 오늘의 주제는 우리 시대 최고의 과학자 리처드 도킨스가 들려주는 나의 과학 인생입니다. 과학저널 스캐틱 발행인인 마이클 셔먼은 이렇게 말한 바 있습니다. 한 세기 뒤 역사학자들은 20세기 후반에 세상을 바꿔놓은 과학계의 전문가들이 누구누구였는지 꼽아볼 것이다. 그 짧은 명단 중에서도 최고는 두말할 것 없이 리처드 도킨스일 것이다. 또한 뉴욕타임스는 이렇게 평했습니다. 현대 과학계에서 자신이 기여한 바를 자랑스럽게 여길 만한 자격이 충분한 사람이 있다면, 심지어 승리감마저 느껴도 좋을 사람이 있다면 그건 바로 리처드 도킨스다. 자, 그럼 이제부터 서울대학교 장대익 교수님과 함께 도킨스 박사의 평생을 이어온 탁월한 과학적 모험들과 화려한 직접 인생에 대해 이야기 나눠보겠습니다. 우선 오늘의 대담자 두 분을 소개해드리겠습니다. 먼저 서울대학교 자유전공학부 장대익 교수님이십니다. 교수님께서는 과학과 인문학의 경계에서 공감과 소통을 바탕으로 새로운 교양의 기준을 제시하는 진화학자이자 과학 철학자이십니다. 여러분, 장대익 교수님을 뜨거운 박수로 환영해 주세요. 네, 이어서 바로 리처드 도킨스 박사님을 소개하겠습니다. 리처드 도킨스 박사님은 영국 옥스퍼드 대학 석좌 교수로 동물 행동학에 정통할 뿐만 아니라 분자 생물학, 집단 유전학, 발생학 등 과학 전 분야를 두루 섭렵, 영국의 정치평론지 프로스펙트지의 여론조사 결과 세계 최고의 지성 1위로 뽑힌 바 있습니다. 신이 존재하지 않음을 과학적 논증을 통해 증명하면서 과학계와 종교계의 뜨거운 논쟁을 몰고 온 명저, 만들어진 신은 우리 시대에 가장 많이 읽힌 과학서로 알려져 있죠. 그 밖의 대표작으로는 이기적 유전자, 지상 최대의 쇼, 리처드 도킨스 자서전, 눈먼 시계공 등이 있습니다. 여러분, 리처드 도킨스 박사님을 맞아주세요.
도킨스 선생님의 저서들에 관해서도 저희가 이야기를 하려고 그러고요. 도킨스 선생님의 일생에 대해서도 좀 이야기를 해볼까 합니다. 제가 오늘 이제 백스테이지에서 선생님하고 좀 얘기를 하다가 오늘 어떤 주제로 이야기를 하면 좋을까 서로 이렇게 조율을 하다가 이런 말씀하시더라고요. 내 인생에 대해서 묻지 말고, 오케이, 예, 인생에 대해서 좀 묻지 말고 과학에 대해서 좀 물어라. 왜냐면 과학에 대해서 하고 싶은 말이 많다. 그래서 제가 질문도 조금 바꾸고 그랬습니다. 예, 그러면 본격적으로 한번 질문을 드려볼게요. 한국 방문이 이번이 처음이신데요. 강연회에서 어떤 주장을 하시고 싶었는지, 그리고 또 한국 청주들의 반응이 또 어떻게 느껴지셨는지 좀 그 말씀부터 먼저 시작해 주시죠.
I'm delighted to be in Korea. I've only been here for a couple of days. I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. I've done 2 lectures. I think they were well received. My message for the Korean people, well, since this occasion is put on by my publishers, Jim Young, my message is buy my books.
네, 예, 책을 사보시면 되겠습니다. 예, 그래도 여기 이제 도킨스 선생님을 다들 아시겠지만 조금 소개를 좀 해드리는 게 좋을 것 같아서요. 그 도킨스 선생님은 그냥 제가 선생님이라고 부르겠습니다. 선생님은 지구 최고의 지식인을 뽑는 그런 자리에서 이제 매년 수위를 차지하고 계십니다. 과학자가 이런 자리에 오르는 건 쉽지 않은데요. 제가 이런 질문을 좀 드리고 싶어요. 지식의 세계에서 선생님의 위치가 무엇일까? 어떤 자리를 차지하고 계신다고 생각하시는지. 사실 이건 굉장히 거창한 질문입니다. 그래서 좀 쑥스럽게 느끼실 수도 있을 것 같아서 제가 좀 질문을 바꿔보겠습니다. 만약에 다윈 선생님이 살아계시다고 한번 해보죠. 그리고 선생님께서 그분을 처음 만나는 자리예요. 그러면 선생님은 다윈 앞에서 이제 자기 자신을 이렇게 소개를 하셔야 되겠죠? 좀 자랑도 하셔야 될지 모르고요. 그래서 다윈 선생님 앞에서 선생님을 소개하신다면 어떻게 하시겠습니까?
Well, it certainly is an embarrassing question. Actually, something rather similar to that did happen to me not long ago because a Japanese television company hired an actor, an English actor, to dress up as Darwin and brought him to my house. And I was supposed to introduce myself to him, and he asked me what had happened in the field of evolutionary biology since his death. So I was able to fill him in on Mendelian genetics and the things that had happened since. And he would of course have been familiar with the fact that in his own time, the genetics of his own time, blending inheritance, was incompatible with natural selection. And actually, it was not only incompatible with natural selection, it was incompatible with observed facts, clearly, obvious observed facts. So I explained to this actor about Mendelian genetics, and he was a good actor, and he did old man acting very well. And he said, "Yes, that's it, that's it." So it was an agreeable. I did not attempt to explain to him whatever role I might have had, nor am I going to do that today.
예, 이제 좀 본격적으로 선생님 소개를 했으니까 좀 더 본격적으로 우리가 궁금한 것들 한번 질문해 보도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 과학에 대해서 이야기를 많이 하시고 싶다고 하셔서 좀 그 얘기부터 시작을 해봤으면 좋겠어요. 흔히들 과학 기술이 인류의 삶의 조건을 엄청나게 향상을 시켰지만 더 큰 문제들을 야기했다고들 합니다. 가령 뭐 지구 온난화 문제라든가 생태계 파괴 문제라든가 원자력 문제라든가 뭐 이런 문제들이 또 과학에 의해서 생겨난 문제라고들 얘기하죠. 선생님께서 이런 문제들을 풀 수 있는 힘도 여전히 과학이다 이렇게 혹시 생각하시는지 한번 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
It would be quite unfair to say that science has been responsible for climate change. Science is responsible for calling our attention to climate change. Let us not shoot the messenger. Science, as you say, is the best hope to provide answers to the problems that we have. Now, of course, the application of science, the misapplication of science, some might say, in producing terrible weapons, that is awful, and it's a quite separate and interesting moral question whether scientists should refrain from doing research which can be misused in that kind of way. I think it's very difficult to police, it's very difficult to stop academic science. Academic science is the search for knowledge. And I don't think we can really halt that, but I suppose it's true to say that scientists do have a special moral responsibility. Einstein said, if I had known, I would have become a locksmith. That's not, I'm sure, I mean, he didn't really mean that, but we do have a responsibility. If you want to do something bad, then science is the best way to do it. If you want to do something good, science is the best way to do it. Science is the right way to do anything that you want to achieve. The trick is to want to achieve good things.
네, 역시 과학의 앰베서더 대사답게 또 일종의 오해 같은 걸 풀어주신 것 같습니다. 또 다른 통념을 하나 한번 좀 이야기를 해보려고 합니다. 과학은 물질, 뭐 생명, 인간, 우주 뭐 이런 문제에 대해서 사실을 말해줄 수는 있지만 가치, 의미, 또 인간 삶의 실존적인 어떤 조건들, 의미들 뭐 이런 것들에 대해서는 사실 침묵하는 게 아니냐. 그래서 과학은 사실에 대해서 이야기하지만 가치에 대해서는 침묵한다. 뭐 이런 식의 또 생각들을 많이들 하는 것 같습니다. 과학과 가치에 대해서 선생님의 견해는 어떠신지요?
Well, it is often said that science is silent with respect to values and with respect to ultimate questions of existence. Why do we exist at all? Why does the universe exist at all? What's it all about? What's the meaning of life? It may be that science cannot answer those deep and fundamental questions. But if science can't answer them, then I don't think anything else can either. It's a mistake to say, it's a logical error to say, because science can't answer some ultimate question, therefore some other discipline, such as religion, can. I think the best hope of answering these really deep questions, like where do the laws of physics come from? Why does the universe exist? Why do we have a universe in the first place? Science offers the best hope of answering those sorts of questions. It may be that even science will fail to answer those deep questions. Now, as for moral questions, what is right and wrong, again, science is probably silent on the ultimate questions of what is good and what is evil. But it is no less well qualified than religion, certainly. We do have the well-developed philosophy of ethics, moral philosophy, which could be said to apply the scientific method to logical, to ethical reasoning, to moral reasoning. So moral philosophers think like scientists. Moral philosophers, I suggest, think like scientists and tackle a moral question. And although they may not be able to ultimately say what is right and what is wrong, what they can say is you are being logically inconsistent if you believe that so-and-so is right, but at the same time you believe that such and such is right or wrong. So it's a very well-developed logical system for working out moral dilemmas and showing moral contradictions. And I'm all for it. I thoroughly applaud good moral philosophers. I think they are applying what you could think of as the scientific method of thought to moral questions. But ultimately, I suppose you have to provide a value judgment as to what is ultimately right and wrong.
네. 조금 더 구체적인 질문을 드리면 아마 선생님이 더 그 와닿는 말씀을 하실 것 같아서 좀 더 푸시를 해보겠습니다. 선생님이 이기적 유전자 이론이 있어요. 그리고 지금 뭐 뇌과학이 굉장히 발전하면서 사랑이나 행복, 그 다음에 뭐 우리 도덕성 이런 것들에 대해서 과학적 사실들이 많이 밝혀지고 있습니다. 그죠? 그렇다면 그런 사랑과 행복에 대해서 과학적 사실들을 많이 안다고 해서 그런 삶을 살 수 있을까? 과학적 사실과 삶의 관계는 도대체 어떻게 되는가? 뭐 이런 질문을 해볼 수 있을 것 같은데요. 선생님 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
I think I understood the question. I'm not absolutely sure. Love and happiness, words like that, which obviously mean a great deal to us subjectively. And science, the science of evolutionary psychology, which I know is your science, the selfish gene theory, these can help us to understand why our brains feel things like love and happiness. There's a common fallacy, I think, which says because a science is working to understand something like love and happiness, that somehow robs love of all value, of all meaning. Well, of course it doesn't. I mean, a scientist like you or me, we have just the same capacity to love and feel happiness or sadness, unhappiness, joy, all these emotions. We are human. We feel those emotions. As dispassionate scientists, we may attempt to understand them in terms of brain states, but that doesn't in any way lessen the depth of the emotion that we feel. Physiologists will think like that. I'm an evolutionary biologist, and so similarly, I try to understand where those emotions come from. What is the evolutionary origin? What is the Darwinian survival value of the capacity to feel these emotions? And once again, we can come up with perfectly sensible scientific answers to that. And again, it doesn't in any way detract from the depths of the emotion that we feel.
예, 그 리처드 파인만 교수가 그런 말을 한 적이 있죠. 과학은 예를 들어 인문학이나 이런 데서 예술이나 이런 데서 이야기하는 어떤 삶의 의미나 가치, 그런 아름다움 이런 것들을 이야기할 수 없다. 그런 이제 친구들이 그런 반론을 하니까 리처드 파인만이 그런 얘기를 했다고 그래요. 그 과학자들은 사실은 그게 아니고 한 가지를 더 보는데 꽃이 이렇게 피어 있고 꽃잎이 이렇게 돌아가면서 이렇게 그 달려 있지 않습니까? 일반 사람들은 그 꽃잎을 보고 그냥 아름답다라고 얘기하지만 과학자들은 그 꽃잎을 통해서 피보나치 수열 같은 것이 어떻게 여기에 적용되는가 이런 어떤 사실에 관련된 아름다움까지 볼 수 있는 그런 눈을 갖고 있다고 얘기했는데 아마 선생님도 그런 비슷한 이야기를 하고 계신 것 같습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 여전히 선생님에 대한 아주 강력한 반대자들 중에 한 부류는 이런 인문학자들, 철학자들, 종교를 갖고 있는 사람들인 것 같아요. 여전히 과학적 세계관을 얘기하지만 그것만으로 충분하지 않다. 그거는 어떤 부족함이 있는 것이다. 이렇게 얘기를 하는 것 같은데요. 그런 지적들에 대해서 어떻게 대답하실 수 있는지.
I've always loved that quotation from Richard Feynman. He says you see the flower and it's beautiful. I see the flower and it's beautiful, but I also understand why it has the properties that it does. He actually made a mistake there. He said, I understand why it's red. It's red to attract insects. Insects can't see red. So it was an unfortunate example for him to have chosen. If it's a red flower, it's probably attracting hummingbirds. Well, I've written a whole book about the poetry of science, unweaving the rainbow. And the phrase unweaving the rainbow comes from the English poet John Keats, who complained that Isaac Newton had destroyed the poetry of the rainbow by explaining it. And the whole of my book really was making the same point as the Richard Feynman quote that you've given, that to understand the rainbow as Newton did, to understand what the rainbow is not to detract from its aesthetic value, but to enhance it. And that applies not just to rainbows, but to everything about us. The universe, the world, is beautiful, and it's made more beautiful by our scientific understanding of it. Who could fail to be moved aesthetically, looking up at the stars, looking up at the Milky Way, looking up at the galaxy of which we're a part? Think to yourself how far away it is. Think to yourself that what you're looking at happened a very, very long time ago. And different stars are happening at different lengths of time ago. Do the same thing with fossils, looking back in time in fossils. And think to yourself of the immensity of time which has elapsed since this animal, the fossil animal, was alive. These are deep, moving aesthetic experiences. And I have had only an enhancement of my aesthetic experience by my understanding of science, limited as it is. And people who have a higher understanding of science, like Richard Feynman, I would think have an even greater aesthetic appreciation. The great physicists have always said that they are moved, that they are actually inspired by the beauty of their equations, for example. There is a deep aesthetic beauty, mathematicians tell us, in their equations. I can't appreciate that. I'm not enough of a mathematician. I see beauty in the living world, not just looking at it as a beautiful sight, but it's the beauty of understanding that really moves me.
네, 파인만이 살아계시다면 이렇게 또 생물학자로서 보완을 해주시는 게 매우 또 인상 깊게 느껴질 것 같습니다. 이제는 좀 선생님 책에 대해서 얘기를 좀 해보겠습니다. 많은 역작들을 쓰셨죠. 우리가 다 그래서 여기 모였는데요. 이기적 유전자, 만들어진 신, 이런 역작들을 쓰시면서 한국을 포함한 전 세계 독자들을 이렇게 끌어들이셨습니다. 도대체 어떠한 포인트가 어떠한 점들이 이 선생님의 책들을 좋아하게 만들었다고 생각하시는지 선생님의 선생님 책에 사로잡힌 그 이유에 대해서 한번 저자로서 한번 얘기를 해주시면 어떨까요?
What is it about my 40-year-old book that makes it gripping to modern readers? I can't answer that kind of question. Maybe because it's very well written. I don't know.
정답입니다.
How can you expect me to answer that? Let me get how to go. Well, I wrote in the preface to the book that it could be read almost as though it was science fiction, but it's not science fiction, it's science fact. And in a way, I suppose I'm harking back to my answer to the previous question. There is a romance in understanding, and calling it science fiction in a way captures a little bit of that. The idea that each one of us and every living creature, every animal, every plant is a survival machine for the genes that ride inside it. I described it as a robot carrying the genes inside it, the genes which make it do what it does. And if they're successful, those genes will get passed on. And successful means successful in making the body, making the robot, making the survival machine survive and reproduce, and therefore pass on to future generations those very same genes, the genes that made it survive in the first place. So we survival machines, we robot survival machines, are good at what we do, which is flying or digging or running or jumping or swinging through the trees, whatever it is for the different species. We're good at what we do because we inherit the genes of an unbroken line of successful ancestors. Well, it is a bit like science fiction, but it has some of the appeal of science fiction. And I think that if you really press me to answer the question, why does the book have appeal, I would say it's that.
예. 그렇군요. 저도 SF를 좀 더 생각을 해봐야겠습니다. 선생님 책을 저는 개인적인 얘기를 조금 말씀드리면서 얘기를 해봤으면 좋겠는데요. 제가 대학생 때 눈먼 시계공을 읽었습니다. 블라인드 워치메이커죠. 읽은 후에 제 인생의 지적인 어떤 전환점을 얻었고요. 제 인생의 책이라고도 할 수 있습니다. 또 최근에 출간된 선생님 자서전을 보면 니코 팀버겐이라든가 존 메이널 스미스, 해밀턴이라든가 이런 기라성 같은 학자들에게 그 얘기가 나오고요. 또 선생님이 처음으로 펜네터를 보낸 더글라스 아담스에 대한 얘기도 나옵니다. 그래서 제가 이런 궁금증이 생겼습니다. 선생님을 사로잡은 지식인들과 그들의 책에 대해서 궁금한데요. 만약에 선생님이 인생에서 딱 한 권의 책을 꼽으라고 하면 선생님이 영향을 받은 책 중에서 딱 한 권을 꼽으라고 하면 어떤 책을 왜 고르시겠습니까?
You're asking me about a book by another author which inspired me? Yes. I would say, well, can I have more than one? For literary style, I would say anything by Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize-winning medical scientist, biologist who had a beautiful style, a kind of patrician wit, which we would all do well to emulate. Carl Sagan, I think, is the one that I would pick. Carl Sagan probably, Pale Blue Dot is a wonderful aesthetic experience, but the demon-haunted world, science as a candle in the dark, and the last phrase, candle in the dark, I borrowed as part of the title of my second autobiography, Brief Candle in the Dark. Carl Sagan's science as a candle in the dark, the demon-haunted world. It's a book about superstition and the the denial of superstition, the destruction of superstition, the substitution of superstition by science, and how the medieval superstitions about witchcraft are now replaced by things like astrology and other nonsense. I think that is a book that I would recommend everybody to read. It's a book that you can't put down once you start reading it. It's an inspiring book, a beautifully written book, like all his books, and indeed like his television program, Cosmos, which was recently redone by Neil deGrasse Tyson in a rather different style, but very, very well. Both of them are very well worth watching.
예. 저도 사실은 여러분만 흥분해 있는 게 아니라 저도 흥분해 있어서 막 말이 길어져서 선생님이 질문이 그거냐고 말씀을 대신 물어주셨는데요. 책 얘기를 조금만 더 해보겠습니다. 이제 다른 선생님, 다른 저자들의 책에 대해서 이야기를 했지만, 저 같은 경우에는 눈먼 시계공을 읽은 다음에 이기적 유전자를 읽어서 진짜로 지적인 충격 때문에 잠을 며칠간 못 자는 그런 경험들을 하셨을 겁니다. 아마 그런 경험들 저도 했고요. 세계화는 혁명이 일어났었죠. 그리고 이기적 유전자의 마지막 장을 잇는 확장된 표현형이라는 책이 있는데요. 제가 그 책을 읽고 제가 지금 연구하고 있는 생물 철학이라고 하는 분야에 뛰어들게 됐습니다. 그리고 만들어진 신 같은 책에서는 현대 무신론 운동의 지침서라고도 할 수 있겠죠. 정말 막 아드레날린이 분비되는 그런 책이었고요. 뭐 지상 최대 이슈에서는 창조론의 사망 선고를 한 그런 일을 하셨고, 그다음에 현실 그 마법, 그 가슴 뛰는 마법에서는 일종의 도킨스표 과학 입문서, 저는 그렇게 표현하고 싶습니다. 그런 것들을 선사하셨습니다. 자, 여기 선생님의 책을 단 한 권도 읽지 않은 분들이 있다고 한번 해보겠습니다. 물론 그렇진 않으실 거예요. 그렇지만 여기 인터넷 생중계를 보시는 분은 그런 분도 계실 테니까요. 어떤 책에서 시작해서 어떻게 읽어나가면 될 것인지 선생님이 직접 가이드를 좀 간단하게 해주시기 바랍니다. 선생님의 책을, 내 책을 이런 책부터 읽는 것이 나를 이해하는데, 내가 이야기하는 과학을 이해하는 데 도움이 된다. 한번 가이드를 한번 해주시죠.
Well, which book should you start first? If you're a child, then The Magic of Reality. Actually, if you're an adult, you might almost do that as well. If you're skeptical about evolution, I imagine nobody here is, but if you are, then the greatest show on earth is the evidence for evolution. The Selfish Gene, as I've already said, is a kind of science fiction-y vision of the way to understand evolution. It's kind of turning on its head the conventional way of looking at it. It's not really saying anything different from the orthodox neo-Darwinian synthesis, but it's saying it in a kind of upside-down way, which might appeal to some people. The Blind Watchmaker and Climbing Mount Improbable are somewhat similar to each other, both of them attacking the idea of design, or rather explaining how design is really a kind of illusion of design produced by natural selection. Of those two, I actually think Climbing Mount Improbable is a somewhat better book than The Blind Watchmaker. They both do rather similar things. And the Climbing Mount Improbable is the least best-selling of my books, and I would like to promote it, therefore. The Extended Phenotype is the only book that I've written for a technical audience. I like to think that it can be read by a non-technical audience as well. It is probably if I have a claim to originality, it probably is The Extended Phenotype. I probably don't have time to go into it. It takes a whole book to explain. But there's that. The God Delusion is the only book of mine which is an out-and-out attack on religion, although all my books have a kind of implicit skepticism about religion built into them. The Ancestor's Tale is my largest book. It's a very, very long book. It's a complete account of the history of life, written jointly with Yan Wong, my former student and now colleague. What Yan and I did was to do the history of life backwards. So we take it as a kind of pilgrimage from the present into the past. We set off as human pilgrims into the past, and we go further and further back in time. And as we go back in time, we are joined successively by other pilgrims. 5 or 6 million years into the past, we are joined by the chimpanzee and bonobo pilgrims. And then another 1 million years into the past, we are then joined by the gorilla pilgrims. And then about 4 million years further back in the past, we're joined by the orangutan pilgrims, then the gibbon pilgrims, then the Old World monkeys, then the New World monkeys, then the lemurs, and so on. And we go on and on, back and back and back in time, until we come to the origin of life. I don't know whether Korean audiences are familiar with Geoffrey Chaucer, the father of English literature in a way, who wrote in Middle English the Canterbury Tales. It's a story of pilgrimage where the pilgrims set off for Canterbury on a sacred pilgrimage, and they tell tales as they go. And Yan Wong and I did the same thing in The Ancestor's Tale. We made our pilgrims tell tales. But the tales they told were biological lessons. So it's a very large book, a very long book. Maybe you could start with that one. Let me think what else. My 2 volumes of autobiography, I mentioned them before. I probably left something out, but anyway. No. I mean that'll do.
도끼 선생님의 저자 직강이죠. 저자 직강으로 내 책을 뭐부터 어떻게 읽으면 된다, 어떤 내용인가를 들으셨는데 아마 굉장히 유니크한, 굉장히 유일한 자료가 아닐까 생각합니다. 어디에서도 이런 말씀을 하신 적이 없기 때문에 제가 한번 여쭤봤습니다. 그 중에서 선생님이 딱 한 권 다윈 선생님에게 선물하겠다. 이거는 내가 정말 다윈 선생님에게 선물할 만한 자랑스러운 책이다라고 하신다면 그 책은 무엇일까요? 간단하게 대답해 주십시오. 당혹스럽게 또 질문을 드렸습니다.
Not because I'm particularly proud of it, but I think probably The Selfish Gene, because that would be the one that would, he would recognize it as his theory, but he would recognize it as his theory put in a different way, which I like to think he would like very much. Whereas the other books would just be explaining in modern terms what he already knows. I think it would have to be The Selfish Gene.
예. 선생님 책에 대해서 자세히 이야기를 들어봤는데요. 이제 과학자로서 선생님의 삶에 대해서 조금 더 알고 싶어지네요. 교수님은 저자이시기 전에 이제 과학자시고요. 자서전에 보면 그 동물학의 길로 어떻게 들어서게 됐는지 그 솔직 담백하게 이야기를 해주고 계십니다. 이렇게 질문드리고 싶어요. 과학자로서 가장 희열을 느꼈던 순간이 어떤 순간이신지, 그리고 진화생물학계에서 선생님의 어떤 독창적인 공헌이 있다고 생각하신다면 그것이 무엇인지 간단하게 한번 말씀해 주시기 바랍니다.
I suppose it's true to say that I came late to science. I went into the science stream at school at the time when one had to make a choice, which was about the age of 16. Not really for any very good reason. I possibly was just following my father, who had read botany at Oxford, and so I was interested in biology, but I only really became deeply inspired by biology in my second year at Oxford, as an undergraduate. And I think it was probably the tutorial system at Oxford that did that for me. Oxford and Cambridge have a rather unique educational system based upon individual tutorials, where you spend an hour each week with a tutor, alone with the tutor, having written an essay during the past week, set by the tutor, and the tutor has given a list of readings which are all from the original research literature rather than from textbooks. So think what that means to an undergraduate. The undergraduate is sent into the library with a list of research papers to read the original research, probably the latest research, on a particular rather detailed topic. Now what that means is that instead of just learning the textbook knowledge, which every student ought to know, you have the opportunity as a 19, 20-year-old student to become a kind of world authority on this very narrow subject that you spent the entire week reading up. You go into the tutorial then with the tutor, knowing, if you're any good, knowing more about it than the tutor, because it's a long time since he's read it up. And that is a remarkable experience for a young student. It's not a very good education in one respect, because it means that you don't come out of university with a well-rounded knowledge of everything that's in the textbook. It means that you've spent a week on a highly specialized subject and become an expert in that one subject, and then next week you switch to a very different subject. So you're very experienced in how to make an argument, how to evaluate evidence, how to look at a controversial subject and come to a decision about the controversial subject, which is, I suppose, a good training for all sorts of aspects of life, and it does inspire you in science. And I became inspired by animal behavior because I did tutorials with Nico Tinbergen, who later won a Nobel Prize for his part in founding the science of ethology. And so it was that inspiration by Tinbergen which led to my applying to do doctoral research in animal behavior. So I suppose if you're asking me for a turning point, that would be it. It would be tutorials with Tinbergen, who had a very interesting, sort of ultra-Oxford approach to tutorials, actually. He didn't give me a whole reading list of original research papers. He gave me each week he gave me one PhD thesis to read. And so I had to read this thesis, and I had to follow up the literature in the bibliography at the end of the thesis. And I had to behave almost like a PhD examiner, although I was an undergraduate. So it's once again this concentration on a very detailed subject, very inspiring. And as I say, it led to the turning point in my life to do doctoral research under Tinbergen.
굉장히 독특한 경험을 하셨네요. 영국 그 교육 튜터 시스템에 대한 이야기도 사실은 자서전에 많이 나와서 되게 인상 깊게 들었는데 그걸 좀 자세히 설명을 해주신 것 같습니다. 요즘같이 그냥 이렇게 약간 피상적인 지식을 그냥 주입받는 그런 것과는 다른 방식의 굉장히 깊이 자기주도적으로 학습하는 그런 것들이었던 것 같고요. 선생님에 대해서 조금 더 질문을 좀 드려보도록 하겠습니다. 과학자로서의 삶에 대해서. 지금은 사실 선생님은 과학자 역할이 과학자라기보다는 과학을 다른 전문가들이나 대중들한테 아주 고급스럽게 알리고 소개하고 또 과학자 세계관의 중요성을 이제 널리 전파하시는 그런 어떤 과학의 대사 혹은 과학의 커뮤니케이터 역할을 더 비중 있게 하고 계시다고 생각이 듭니다. 근데 사실 그 두 역할 사이에서, 그러니까 과학자와 과학 커뮤니케이터의 역할 사이에는 좀 긴장과 갈등이 사실 있기 마련인데요. 또 실제로 과학자 공동체에서는 그런 과학 소통을 위한 노력들을 되게 폄훼하기도 하고요. 그래서 엣지 재단 설립자인 존 브록만이 이름 붙인 제3의 문화, The Third Culture라고 하는 것을 사실 개척하신 그런 한 과학자로서 기존의 과학자들 또 과학도들에게 연구와 그런 소통의 관계에 대해서 어떤 말씀을 해주고 싶으신지 그걸 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
You will appreciate, of course, that the interpreter goes on after, and that's hence the long pause. By the way, the interpreter is doing an amazing job. I congratulate her.
Yeah.
Carl Sagan, whom I mentioned earlier, was the master communicator of science. He was also a very good scientist in his own right, but he did suffer from the phenomenon you mentioned, which is looking down upon the communicator. And there's in America they even talk about the Carl Sagan effect, which is failure to get elected to the National Academy of Sciences because of, perhaps one could be so bold as to say, jealousy on the part of some of his fellow scientists. So he was not, I think, never elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which he of course should have been. I haven't suffered from that, to the same extent at least. I have been elected to the Royal Society, which is the British equivalent of the American National Academy of Sciences. And I don't know to what extent people have looked down upon me as a communicator. They may well have done. And there is a bit of a tension, as you say. Becoming less so. I think more and more active working scientists are recognizing that part of their responsibility as working scientists is to communicate what they're doing to the general public, if only for mercenary reasons, because of course their grant money depends upon government, and that ultimately means taxpayers' money. And so they have to keep, they have to make the public convinced that what they're doing is worthwhile. And it shouldn't be difficult to do because it is worthwhile, but you do need to go out there and explain it. I think there was a time when in America, the National Science Foundation, which is one of the main grant-giving bodies in America, made it a condition of getting a grant to do research that you had to spend a certain proportion of your time going out into the public arena and explaining to the public what you were doing. I'm not sure if that's still the case. I think it would be a very good thing if it was. Explain your science. It's inspiring, it's exciting, it shouldn't be dull, it should never be boring. The enthusiasm of a working scientist ought to be infectious. A scientist who's any good is enthusiastic. And that should come across. I like to make a pitch for one particular way of communicating science as opposed to another. It's fashionable to say that in order to make science understandable and palatable, you need to make it down to earth, familiar to everyday existence. Bring it into the home. I rather go the other way. I rather prefer to look up at the stars. Never mind about the science of cookery and what happens to the protein when you boil an egg, which is one approach to making science friendly. I prefer to say, never mind about boiling an egg. Look up at the stars. Do the Carl Sagan. I called it the Carl Sagan approach to science, as opposed to to space science, as opposed to the non-stick frying pan approach. The non-stick frying pan gets its name from the fact that at one time people justified the space program by the fact that the non-stick frying pan was a byproduct of the space program. And I've compared that to justifying music on the grounds that it's good exercise for the violinist's right arm. Music is valuable in itself. It's a great aesthetic experience. And science is a great aesthetic experience. Never mind whether it's useful, never mind whether you get as a spin-off the non-stick frying pan. The same goes for fighting to save the rainforests of the world. People will argue that we need to fight to save the Brazilian rainforest because occasionally you'll discover a drug which is useful, like aspirin. Well, that's fine. Science is useful. But that's the least important thing about science.
예, 박수가 나오네요. 예, 감사합니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 과학자들에 대해서 많은 분들이 편견을 갖고 계시죠. 예를 들면 편견을 갖고 계시는데요. 예를 들면 똑똑하지만 사회성이 떨어지고 숫자에는 밝은데 세상에는 무지한 그런 사람들. 그런 사람들이 과학 분야에 종사한다고들 또 알려져 있습니다. 그렇게들 사람들이 많이 믿고 있고요. 그런 사람들을 위해서 과학자의 삶이 얼마나 매력적인지 한번 이 자리에 계신 분들을 위해서 한번 간단하게 설득을 해주시죠. 과학자로 살면 정말 매력적인 삶을 살 수 있다. 뭐 이렇게 생각하신다면 간단하게 한번 말씀을 해주시면 어떨까요?
Yes, I think that sort of came up earlier in another connection. The life of a scientist is the life of that human being who is the scientist, and scientists are human beings. There are a great variety of different human beings. We have our loves and our hates. We have our likes and our dislikes. We do other things apart from science. So I think the sort of stereotype of the scientist as a cold, calculating, we murder to dissect. Is false, and I think you will find very boring scientists. You will find very interesting, exciting scientists. Scientists may be musicians, they may be artists, they may be great writers, they may be great lovers. There are all sorts of different things that scientists are. Some of them are good at it, some of them are not, and that's true of people in all walks of life.
네. 또 과학에 대해서 갖고 있는 또 다른 편견 하나만 더 말씀드려보고 싶은데요. 과학자들은 모두들 한 목소리를 낸다. 어떤 주제에 대해서 이렇게들 또 많이 얘기를 합니다. 근데 실상은 사실 그런 게 아닌 것 같은데요. 선생님의 주 무대인 진화생물학계만 보더라도 사실 뭐 선생님 전설이죠. 선생님과 뭐 스티븐 제이 골드, 작고하신 스티븐 제이 골드 간의 그 치열한 논쟁은 뭐 아직도 지금 전설이고, 저도 뭐 거기 가는 책을 쓰긴 했지만요. 이런 것들을 생각해 볼 때 과학은 논쟁이다라고 하는 명제를 한번 생각해 볼 수 있을 것 같은데요. 그런 논쟁의 한 진영에 계신 수장이신 분으로서 이 명제에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지, 과학은 정말 논쟁인지, 그 논쟁이 어떤 의미를 갖고 있는지 뭐 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Scientists disagree with each other as other people do. I think it's probably fair to say, though, that science has a rather privileged position in that we probably can agree about what it would take to make us agree. If we disagree, it's probably because the evidence is not all in. It may be that there's some verbal misunderstanding, semantic misunderstanding, but that should be possible to sort out by argument and by looking at new evidence. Sometimes scientific disputes are solved by the scientists getting together and doing an experiment together, doing a joint experiment together. Science does at least pay lip service to the idea that that there is a truth out there which can be achieved. You mention Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, tragically no longer with us. I have had a number of disagreements with him, which I think at least partly result from misunderstanding. I don't know how much you want me to go into that, but part of the disagreement has been about whether evolution is gradual or stepped, the so-called theory of evolution by jerks. He called it punctuated equilibrium. As a paleontologist, he was interested in the fact that if you look at the fossil record, you don't always see a smooth gradation. You sometimes see what look like sudden jumps in evolution. Where I think he went wrong was to conflate three different kinds of jump and in an almost poetic way see them as though they were the same, when actually they're very different. Those three jumps are macromutation, that's to say a sudden mutational change which is non-gradual. The animal, the child animal is radically different from the parent animal in a single mutational step. The extreme examples of this are in fruit flies growing a leg where there should be an antenna, for example. Now that's a macromutation. That's jump number one. Jump number two is what you get when you have a mass extinction, as when the dinosaurs went extinct, and then you have a sudden new flowering of evolution of a different kind, in this case the mammals. That, in another sense, is a kind of jump. It's a very, very different kind of jump. And the third kind of jump is punctuated equilibrium itself, which takes a little bit longer to explain. When a new species is formed from a daughter species, from a parent species, it usually happens by a subpopulation of the original species getting accidentally separated from the original population, perhaps by a geographical accident, perhaps by a river changing its course and separating two populations, so that the two populations are now free to evolve in different directions because there's no longer gene flow between them. Or a population may be founded by somebody being blown off course onto an island. This happened on Galapagos, for example. And on the Galapagos Island you have animals which are clearly derived from the mainland of South America. But because they accidentally managed to get onto these islands, they were free to evolve in different directions. That's how new species get formed. Now, later on, when a new species that has been formed on an island gets back onto the mainland, it will be very different from what's on the mainland. And if you are digging for fossils on the mainland, you may suddenly see this new species appear in the fossil record. And it looks like a jump, but it's not a jump. What happened was that there was perfectly ordinary gradual evolution going on, slowly and gradually on the island. But then when the island population gets blown back onto the mainland, it looks like a jump. That's punctuated equilibrium, and it's a totally different kind of jump from macromutation. Gould, I think, confused the two, not in his own mind, but in his readers' minds, and led his readers to think that there was something radically un-Darwinian about punctuated equilibrium. Absolute nonsense. It's standard Darwinian evolution happening somewhere else.
예, 아마 스티븐 제이 골드 선생님이 살아계시다면 또 이런 대답에 대해서 또 어떻게 반응하실지 사실 궁금하긴 한데요. 어쨌든 몇 가지 외를 제외하고는 다 서로 동의한다. 논쟁이긴 하지만 그런 말씀을 하셨습니다. 논쟁에 대해서 이야기를 하니까 뭐 사실 선생님이 굉장히 논쟁적인 책을 많이 쓰셨잖아요. 뭐 이기적 유전자도 그렇지만 뭐 만들어진 신이라든가 뭐 지상 최대 이슈 같은 경우에는 사실 과학 종교와의 논쟁이기도 하고요. 뭐 주로 종교와의 논쟁이죠. 그래서 선생님한테 질문 드리고 싶은 것 중 하나는 선생님이 경험하셨던 최악의 논쟁, 그리고 이거는 정말 재미있는 논쟁이었고 많은 걸 배웠다라고 하는 최고의 논쟁, 간단하게 하나씩 이야기를 해주십시오.
What are the best and worst arguments or disputes I've had in my life? With respect to religion or not with respect to religion?
Religion에 대해서. Religion.
Religion. I have never in my life heard any good argument in favor of religion. If you twist my arm to think of the least bad argument, I suppose it would be the argument from the laws of physics being too good to be true. The idea that the laws of physics and the fundamental constants of physics, those half dozen or so numbers which physicists can measure, but which they have no explanation for. They just simply accept these numbers as constants. And it has been argued, plausibly enough, that if any one of those half dozen or so fundamental constants were different, the universe as we know it could not have come into existence, and we could not exist, therefore. And the temptation has been to suggest that, therefore, these numbers have been deliberately set to be just right to bring us into existence. You could imagine that there's a whole lot of little dials, little knobs that you can twiddle to adjust, like a rheostat, like a volume control on something like this. And all 6 of them have to be in exactly the right position. If the gravitational constant was slightly weaker, there would be no galaxies, no stars, no chemistry, no life, etc. That is the argument from fine adjustment of the physical constants. The argument is that there must be some divine knob twiddler who twiddles the knobs and gets to exactly the right value. It's a very bad argument because, of course, it doesn't explain anything. It leaves open the question of where the divine knob twiddler came from in the first place. You haven't made any progress in explaining it by just saying there's an intelligence that simply knew how to adjust the physical constants. You're still faced with the problem of how those physical constants come to have exactly the right values. The probable right answer to it has been called the anthropic principle. Because we exist, because we are here, we must be in the kind of universe which is capable of giving rise to us. That's the anthropic principle. And if the constants were any different, we wouldn't be here. That in itself is not very satisfying. It becomes more satisfying when you add to it the multiverse idea. The multiverse idea is one that physicists come to for other reasons. Other reasons lead physicists to suggest that the universe in which we live is one of billions of universes. All these universes have different values of their fundamental constants, billions of them. Only a tiny minority of these universes in the multiverse have the constants set right to give rise to galaxies and stars and chemistry and life. And of course we have to be in one of that tiny minority of universes because here we are talking about it. That's the anthropic principle. And that is the answer that physicists mostly come to when faced with this dilemma of why the fundamental constants seem to be finely adjusted. Not all physicists accept that they are finely adjusted, but I think probably a majority of them do. So that's the least bad argument, but it's still a bad argument.
예, 뭐 좋은 아규먼트, 좋은 논쟁이 없었다는 말씀을 계속 이렇게 길게 하셨는데요. 네, 충분히 예상 가능한 대답이었죠. 예, 그럼에도 불구하고 이 만들어진 신 같은 책에 보면 이제 그 종교의 미래에 대해서 선생님이 좀 말씀을 하시는 것 같아요. 우리가 사실 궁금합니다. 선생님은 종교의 미래를 어떻게 보시는지, 과연 종교가 살아남을까요? 아니면 종교 유통 기한이 다 끝나서 결국에는 인류의 문화에서 사라지게 될까요? 선생님이 종교의 미래에 대한 선생님 생각을 좀 알고 싶습니다.
I have to make a distinction between what I hope and what I expect. I, of course, hope to see the death of religion. I think it is a pernicious and unhelpful influence on human life. That's not to say all religions are as bad as each other. Some religions are manifestly much worse than others. I'm not all that hopeful that religion will die quickly. Religion is dying in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, in Holland, in Britain. It's more slowly going in the United States. The United States is still a very, very religious country. But as the years go by, the number of people that polls tell us subscribe to a religion is decreasing. We're now up to about 25% of Americans who profess no religion, a fact that has yet to come to the attention of politicians, unfortunately. In Scandinavia, religion is very, very low indeed. You have to make an exception of Islam, which is another matter entirely, and is as I've said before, the most dangerous religion around at the moment, and it's hard to know quite when that will go. In the United States, which I'm somewhat familiar with, I spent a lot of time there, there is a very fierce backlash against atheism. I like to think of this as the death throes. I like to think of it as the cornered animal which sees the end in sight and is fighting tooth and nail against it. Possibly that's wishful thinking. But I live in hopes. I am an optimist. I like to think that if not in my lifetime, maybe in my grandchildren's lifetime, religion will completely die.
예, 예. 네, 역시 도발적인 주장을 하셨고요. 이제 정리를 좀 한번 해보겠습니다. 대담을 정리하고 그 다음에 좀 질의응답을 청중들과 하고 싶은데요. 그 스캡틱의 발행인인 마이클 셔머가 이런 말을 한 적이 있습니다. 그 칼 세이건, 스티븐 제이 골드, 리처드 도킨스 등은 악마가 출몰하는 암흑 같은 우리 세계를 비추는 촛불이다. 안타깝게도 우리는 칼과 스티브를 너무 일찍 잃었고, 그렇지만 행운과 건강한 그런 DNA 덕분에 도킨스는 아직 우리 곁에 남아서 과학적 회의주의의 봉합불이자 전 세계 회의주의자들의 영웅으로 우뚝 서 있다. 이런 코멘트를 한 적이 있습니다. 여러 가지 측면에서 칼 세이건 선생님과 그 리처드 도킨스 선생님이 비교가 되는 것 같아요. 베스트셀러의 저자인데다가 탁월한 과학자이셨고, 근데 코스모스 같은 다큐멘터리는 선생님을 갖고 있지 않으셔서 좀 제가 좀 궁금합니다. 혹시 그런 코스모스 같은 그런 다큐멘터리 대작을 제작하실 그런 기회가 있으신지, 혹은 그런 계획이 있으신지 좀 듣고 싶습니다.
I couldn't possibly aspire to do anything remotely like Cosmos. Carl Sagan was a genius of communication. I have made a few television documentaries, nothing like on the same scale. A couple of about three or four for the BBC, and maybe half a dozen for Channel 4, but not on the same scale. I don't think I could do that. I quite like doing occasional television things, but I'm not that good at it.
하라고 좀 푸시를 해드리고 싶은데요. 네, 이제 마지막으로 제가 대담에서 마지막으로 생각해 온 질문 드리고 저는 대담을 마치도록 하겠습니다. 최근에 이제 선생님이 자서전이 출간됐고 선생님의 사상과 인생에 대해서 많은 분들이 또 재미난 사실을 알게 됐는데요. 선생님은 후대에 어떤 사람으로 기억되고 싶으신지 여쭙고 싶습니다. 이게 마지막 질문입니다.
I would like to be remembered as a scientist who managed to convey some of the excitement and the inspiration, the fascination of science to others. It is so fascinating, so wonderful, that not to do so would be almost a crime. Carl Sagan said something like this: if you're in love, you want to tell the world. And I feel that about science.
네, 박수 보내주시죠. 네.
이어서 질의응답 시간을 갖겠습니다. 평소 도킨스 박사님께 궁금하셨던 것이나 오늘 대담 내용에서 궁금하셨던 부분이 있으면 자유롭게 질문해 주세요. 네, 가운데 커트머리 여자분. 네.
네, 안녕하세요. 오늘 강연 잘 들었습니다. 저는 과학에 관심이 많은 아이의 엄마인데요. 어린 시절에는 도킨스 박사님은 어떤 걸 주로 가지고 노셨는지, 그리고 학창 시절에 이제 꿈은 무엇이었는지 궁금합니다.
That got a laugh, and I'm not quite sure. I think I must have missed the joke. What toys did I play with? I played with model trains. I played with puppets, string puppets, marionettes. Yes, I suppose those were. I'm too old to have been in the computer age to play. I no doubt nowadays the toys that I played with would be superseded by anything on a computer, and so modern children, I think, are in a way spoiled to have computer toys. I started to play with computers when I was in my 20s, and they were toys, and I played with them exactly like toys. I devoted too much of my life to playing with computers. I became addicted to computer programming, which is very, very much like playing with toys, a sort of adult toys. And I did quite ridiculous things like write my own word processor program. And I wrote one book, The Blind Watchmaker, on my own word processor, which was a complete waste of my time. I could have been writing another book at that time. But so that's, I suppose, that's probably the best answer I can give to the toys that I played with, but I didn't start playing with them until I was in my 20s.
네, 답이 되셨나요? 네. 다음 질문은 네, 가운데 네, 남자분. 네.
질문 기회를 주셔서 감사합니다. 오늘 대담 정말 잘 들었고요. 이번에 새로 나온 자서전을 정말 인상 깊고 즐겁게 읽었거든요. 특히 인상적이었던 게 거기서 70번째 생일 파티에서 읊으신 시가 지금도 생각이 납니다. 아직은 내게 어두운 밤을 순순히 길들일 시간이 있다로 시작하던 시인데요. 그래서 궁금한 게 과학자로서 이제 아직 남은 인생이 많이 있으신데 최종 목적지는 어디신지, 그래서 남은 생애 동안 무엇을 향해 가실 건지가 궁금합니다.
Well, thank you. The question refers to the poem that I wrote for my 70th birthday, which made allusions to various other poets, and talked about the fact that although I was 70, I intended to go on for a very long time yet. My mother celebrated her 100th birthday a couple of weeks ago, and so I hope at least to catch up with her. I have just finished writing, or rather collecting together, an anthology of my past writings, a book called Science in the Soul, S-O-U-L, which is in the hands of the publishers now, and which will come out sometime this year, I think. I don't usually look very far ahead. I haven't got a particular plan for what my next book might be. A possibility would be another children's book, like The Magic of Reality, but answering different questions. The Magic of Reality is a book where each chapter begins with a question at the head of the chapter, like why do we have night and day? Why do we have winter and summer? What is an earthquake? And it begins with mythological answers to the question, and then goes into the true scientific answer. So I might do a kind of second volume of Magic of Reality. Another possibility would be a book about life in the universe, as opposed to just on this planet. Of course, we don't know anything about life elsewhere in the universe, but the question I'm interested in is how much of what we know about life on this planet has to be true, because that's the only way for life to be, in which case we can predict that life on other planets will have certain properties, and how much of it just happens to be true on this planet. So, for example, does there have to be something like DNA? I imagine not actually DNA, but a digital genetic code. And I think the answer is yes. I think probably that is a necessary property of life, that there should be a digital genetics. Is it a necessary property of life that it shall be Darwinian life? And I think again the answer is yes. I think there's probably no other force for producing the complexity and the illusion of design which we call life other than Darwinian selection, albeit of a very different kind probably, or it might be a very different kind, but that's the kind of question I want to ask. Other questions like, will there have to be sex? Probably not. Sex might be one of those things which is just local, or it may not. That's an interesting question to discuss. Will there be eyes? I suspect on any planet where light travels in straight lines without too much fog or mist, you're likely to get eyes. Eyes have evolved so many times on this planet independently, many times independently on this planet. It seems that you can predict that life in the universe will probably evolve eyes. Intelligence, a more difficult question, because intelligence, human intelligence, linguistic intelligence, has evolved only once on this planet. So that's not something that life apparently is particularly eager to evolve. But again, that's the kind of question which I might have a chapter on. So I haven't made any definite plans, but that might be a book that I could write.
네, 다음 질문. 네, 저기 통로 쪽에 여자분. 네.
강연 되게 잘 들었고요. 자서전을 쓰시면서 굉장히 자신의 삶을 돌아보는 시간을 가지셨을 거라고 생각해요. 그렇다면 도킨슨 박사님께서는 인생에 가장 잘한 선택과 가장 아쉬웠던, 가장 잘못된 선택이라고 생각했던 것이 무엇이 있으신지 궁금해서 질문 드립니다.
I'm not sure about the best choice and the worst choice. I am interested in the general question of how far what happens to us in our life depends vitally on a particular thing that happened earlier. If, for example, some very minor choice that any of us has made, in my case, my parents chose to send me to a particular school rather than another school, or I got into Oxford rather than I only probably just got into Oxford. What if I'd failed to get into Oxford? Would my entire life have been different? Or is there a kind of magnetic pull which pulls you back to the same pathway as you would have had anyway, even if that choice had not been made? So you see, I've evaded your question. I haven't answered the question, what's the best choice and the worst choice. I've turned it instead into a more general question. How important are choices in determining the rest of our life? And I don't know the answer to that question. I almost, instead of working with Nico Tinbergen on animal behavior, I almost chose to work on biochemistry. It seems to me highly likely that if I had done that, then I would never have written any of the books that I have actually written, although one could argue that maybe the magnetic pull would have meant that I would have written something like the books that I've written, albeit from a biochemical point of view, rather than from a whole animal behavior point of view. Perhaps the best choice I made was to go and work with Nico Tinbergen. I think I've kind of answered that already, but I'm not sure.
네, 다음 질문. 네, 가운데 머플러 하신 남자분. 네.
네, 저도 강의 너무 잘 들었고요. 교수님 최근에 교수님에 대한 이제 평가에 관련해서 좀 질문을 좀 드리고 싶은데요. 이전에 만들어진 신이나 과학 서적들을 보면 그 책 이후의 반응이 리처드 도킨스 하면 굉장히 도발적이고 합리적인 과학자다 이런 이제 평가가 또 있는 것 같고, 최근에 이제 나온 그 자서전을 보면 굉장히 청년 때 시도 좋아하고 그리고 음악적인 감수성도 굉장히 뛰어나고요. 글도 어떻게 보면 감수적인 필력이라고 이렇게 말씀을 좀 드려야 되나요? 그렇게 좀 보이는데 굉장히 인간적이고 감성적으로 보이는데요. 두 가지 평가 중에 말씀드렸던 대로 도발적이고 합리적인 과학자로 평가받는 것과 감성적이고 인간적인 과학자로 평가받는 것 둘 중 혹시 선택하라고 하면 어떤 쪽을 좀 듣고 싶은지, 그리고 또 이유는 또 어떤 건지 하나 좀 여쭙고 싶고, 혹시 하나 질문이 더 괜찮다면 시를 굉장히 많은 시가 또 소개됐는데 이후에 혹시 시인으로서 어떤 좀 글을 쓰고 싶은 욕심은 없는지 두 가지 질문 좀 드리고 싶습니다.
Thank you. That's very nice. Well, I have been accused of being provocative and aggressive and strident and shrill. Usually not by people who know me, sometimes by people who read what I write. I think there is a tendency to mistake clarity for aggression. I wonder whether you agree with this, I suspect that to some people, clarity, plain speaking, sounds provocative, sounds aggressive. Let me give an example. A few years ago, in a book review in the New York Times, I was reviewing, I forget which book it was, but I said of creationists, people who did not believe in evolution. I think I meant specifically young Earth creationists who think the world is only a few thousand years old as opposed to billions of years old. Anybody who believes that, I said, is either ignorant, insane, or stupid. That was taken as provocative and aggressive. But of course it isn't. It is simply true. And I went on to add that by far the most important of those three, ignorant, insane, or stupid, is ignorant. Ignorance is no crime. We are all ignorant of most of the things that are to be known. I mentioned that I'm totally ignorant of baseball. It's no crime to be ignorant of baseball. I just am ignorant of baseball. People who believe the world is only 6,000 years old are most likely simply ignorant of the facts. And we scientists are partly to blame for that. We need to get out there and dispel that ignorance. So although it sounds like an aggressive, provocative thing to say, it isn't. It's just a factual statement. If you believe the world is 6,000 years old, you are either ignorant, stupid, or insane, and that's all there is to it. you were kind enough to say you find my writing poetic and even witty. I would love to think that. What more can I say? No, nothing. So did I want to become a poet? I suppose I can do prose poetry. I've never really managed to do verse. I can do comic verse, or sort of frivolous verse, like the verse that ends the Brief Candle in the Dark, which uses other poets, and it's this kind of parody of other poems. I never managed to write a full-blooded, full-length poem in my own right.
예, 시인이 되시기 위해는 조금 늦으신 것 같고요. 예.
이것으로 리처드 도킨스 박사님과 장대 교수님의 네이버 책 문화판 생중계를 마치도록 하겠습니다. 참석해 주신 모든 분들 감사드리고 시청해 주신 네이버 책 문화판 시청자 여러분들도 감사드립니다. 책으로 행복한 세상 김영사는 앞으로 항상 좋은 책, 한 권의 책으로 나와야 할 이유가 분명한 책으로 여러분을 찾아가겠습니다. 감사합니다.